It was a quiet morning on San Juan Island, June 15, 1859. An American farmer, Lyman Cutler, found a large black pig rooting through his potato patch. This pig belonged to Charles Griffin, who worked for the British-owned Hudson's Bay Company. Cutler, tired of the pig's intrusions, raised his rifle and fired. The pig fell dead. That single gunshot would echo far beyond the island because San Juan Island was disputed territory between Great Britain and the United States. Soon, warships sailed into the harbor, soldiers set up camps, and two global powers stood on the brink of war. All because of a hungry pig and an angry farmer. This is the story of the Pig War. To understand why a pig could become so important, you have to understand the island itself. San Juan Island is a beautiful place. It sits in the Salish Sea, nestled between what is now Washington State and Vancouver Island in Canada. It's a landscape of rolling green hills, dense forests, and dramatic rocky coastlines. In the mid-19th century, it was a remote and wild frontier, but it was also strategically vital. The islands command the deep water channels that lead to the mainland. Whoever controlled these islands controlled access to the rich resources of the Pacific Northwest. Both Britain and America knew this well. The problem began with a map, or rather a treaty that was not clear enough. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 was supposed to settle the border dispute between the United States and British North America once and for all. The treaty declared that the boundary should run along the 49th parallel to the coast and then through the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver's island. The trouble was, there wasn't just one channel, there were two main ones, the Haro Strait to the west, closer to Vancouver Island, and the Rosario Strait to the east, closer to the American mainland. San Juan Island lay right in the middle of these two channels. Naturally, both nations interpreted the treaty's vague language to their own advantage. The Americans insisted the boundary was the Haro Strait, which would place the San Juan Islands in U.S. territory. The British were just as certain that the Rosario Strait was the intended line. After all, it was the channel used more frequently by Hudson's Bay Company ships. This disagreement left the islands in a state of legal limbo. Both countries claimed ownership, but neither had firm control. It was a recipe for conflict. For over a decade, the islands existed in a strange sort of shared space. American settlers like Lyman Cutler had begun to arrive, drawn by the promise of fertile land and a new life. They set up small farms and staked their claims. At the same time, the British Hudson's Bay Company had established a large sheep ranch, seeing it as part of their commercial empire. British and American settlers lived side by side, but they were living under two different sets of laws, two different flags, and two very different ideas about who owned the ground beneath their feet. Every interaction was tinged with this underlying tension. Life on San Juan Island was a delicate balance between American settlers and the British. The Americans, independent pioneers, saw the land as theirs by right. They answered to the Washington Territory and viewed the British as intruders. The British presence, embodied by the Hudson's Bay Company, was organized and backed by the Crown. For them, San Juan Island was Bellevue Sheep Farm. Though they traded, mistrust simmered. Disputes over gardens and trespassing were common. The island mirrored the larger imperial rivalry. These disputes showed how flammable the situation was. The shooting of Charles Griffin's pig was the undeniable event. It forced both sides to confront the long-avoided question, who really ruled San Juan Island? Drawn by manifest destiny, the first American settlers on San Juan Island believed in carving out a life through hard work. They saw the island as an unclaimed paradise waiting for American hands. These families and farmers sought a fresh start. They brought tools, livestock, and a fierce sense of independence. Among them was Lyman Cutler, who would find himself at the center of an international incident after staking a claim under the Donation Land Claim Act. They felt ownership over their land, viewing the island as America's next step into the Pacific. Life was hard, marked by isolation and constant labor. They relied on each other, forming a tight-knit community. This strengthened their resolve and reliance on frontier justice. Their worldview was shaped by the conviction that they were on the righteous side of history, setting the stage for confrontation. On the same island, but worlds apart, were the employees of the Hudson's Bay Company. They were agents of a commercial empire. The HBC, a British institution with a royal charter that once controlled a vast fur-trading domain across North America. For the HBC, San Juan Island was strategic, a place to assert British commercial dominance. At the heart of the operation was the Bellevue Sheep Farm, established in 1853. The man in charge was Charles Griffin, a company man overseeing thousands of sheep. His staff included British, Scottish, and Hawaiian laborers. They saw the island as a valuable piece of British territory. The American settlers represented a direct threat. Governor James Douglas instructed Griffin to prevent the Americans from establishing a permanent foothold. The company men were the front-line defenders of Britain's claim. The conflict on San Juan Island was a clash of lifestyles. The American model was individual land ownership. Settlers had their own plots, which they defended as private property. The British model, represented by the Hudson's Bay Company, was large-scale, open-range pastoralism. The HBC saw the island as one vast pasture for its sheep. Fences were an obstacle. This difference in land use caused friction. Americans were frustrated by British animals wandering onto their land. The legal vacuum made disputes impossible to resolve. The island was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Long before the fateful shot was fired, the relationship between the two communities on San Juan Island had been steadily deteriorating. Small incidents, seemingly trivial on their own, accumulated over time, poisoning the atmosphere with suspicion and resentment. These were the seeds of discontent that would eventually bear the bitter fruit of conflict. For instance, the question of taxes became a major point of contention. The sheriff of Whatcom County, from the American mainland, would periodically visit the island and attempt to levy taxes on the Hudson's Bay Company's property and livestock. He saw it as his duty, as the island was, according to the United States, part of his jurisdiction. The Hudson's Bay Company, of course, viewed these attempts as an outrageous affront to British sovereignty. Charles Griffin and his superiors would flatly refuse to pay, arguing that an American official had no authority on British soil. On one occasion, the American sheriff threatened to confiscate company sheep to cover the unpaid taxes. In response, Griffin's men stood guard, armed, and ready to repel any such attempt. The sheriff, outnumbered and outgunned, was forced to retreat empty-handed. This was not just a disagreement over money, it was a direct challenge of authority, a miniature standoff that left both sides feeling more entrenched and more hostile toward the other. Another source of constant irritation was the legal ambiguity. When disputes arose, there was no neutral party to turn to. The Americans established their own rudimentary system of justice, electing a local official to handle minor claims. The British, however, completely ignored this system, answering only to their own magistrate appointed by Governor Douglas. This led to absurd situations where an American might be arrested by a British official, only to be rescued by his armed neighbors who refused to recognize the arrest warrant. Each community acted as if the other did not legally exist, deepening the divide and making any form of cooperation almost impossible. These repeated confrontations created a climate of fear and paranoia. The American settlers, a small minority on the island, felt increasingly vulnerable and threatened by the powerful and well-organized Hudson's Bay Company. They worried that the British might try to forcibly evict them from their homes. The British, on the other hand, saw the Americans as lawless provocateurs, deliberately trying to undermine their operations and provoke a larger crisis. Every stray pig, every broken fence, every heated argument was no longer a simple neighborly dispute. It was interpreted as an act of national aggression, pushing the two communities ever closer to a breaking point. By the spring of 1859, San Juan Island was a place on the edge. The years of unresolved tension had created a palpable sense of impending crisis. The delicate balance that had allowed the two communities to coexist, however uneasily, was beginning to crumble. Both the American settlers and the British company men felt that something had to give. The ambiguous status of the island could not last forever. A decision had to be made, a line had to be drawn, and it seemed increasingly likely that this decision would not be made by diplomats in faraway capitals, but by the men on the ground, whose patience was wearing thin. The American settlers felt a growing sense of urgency. Their numbers were slowly increasing and they had become more vocal in their demands for United States government protection. They wrote petitions to the authorities in Washington Territory, describing their plight and accusing the British of intimidation and harassment. They argued that if the United States did not assert its authority soon, the Hudson's Bay Company would succeed in driving them off the island. They were calling for action, for a clear and decisive move from their government that would put an end to the uncertainty and secure their claims once and for all. Their frustration was reaching a boiling point. On the other side, the British were equally determined not to yield. Governor James Douglas on Vancouver Island was a man of action, not known for his patience with American expansionism. He saw the settlers' activities as a direct challenge to the authority of the British Crown and the interests of the Hudson's Bay Company. He had received reports from Charles Griffin detailing the Americans' encroachments and defiance. Douglas was prepared to use force if necessary to uphold the British claim. The Royal Navy had warships stationed nearby at Esquimalt, a powerful reminder of British military might in the region. The British were not just going to let the island slip away. This was the atmosphere into which Lyman Cutler's pig wandered on that June morning. The situation was no longer just about two competing interpretations of a treaty. It had become personal, emotional, and deeply entangled with the pride and honor of both nations. The island was a pressure cooker and the steam was building. All that was needed was a single, definitive event to blow the lid off. The death of the pig was that event. It was not the cause of the conflict but the catalyst. The final, simple act that transformed years of simmering discontent into an international crisis that brought two world powers to the very brink of war. The morning of June 15, 1859 began like any other for Lyman Cutler. The sun rose over the calm waters of the Salish Sea, casting a gentle light on his small farm. He had worked tirelessly on this plot of land, clearing the trees and rocks to create a space where he could grow food for himself and his family. His potato patch was particularly important, a source of sustenance that would see him through the coming winter. It represented his hard work, his claim to this piece of the American frontier. As he looked out from his cabin, the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. There, in the middle of his precious garden, was a familiar and unwelcome visitor. It was a large black boar, a pig of considerable size, owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. This was not its first visit. The pig had a habit of escaping its enclosure at the British farm and wandering wherever its appetite led it. More often than not, that was straight into Cutler's carefully tended potato patch. He had complained to the pig's keeper, Charles Griffin, on several occasions. He had asked, then demanded, that Griffin keep the animal properly penned. Each time, Cutler felt his concerns were dismissed. The pig would be retrieved, but a few days later it would be back again, tearing up the soil and devouring his crop with impunity. For Cutler, this was more than just a nuisance. It was a profound sign of disrespect. The pig was British property, and its repeated trespasses felt like a deliberate provocation from the powerful Hudson's Bay Company. It was as if they were saying his farm didn't matter, that his American claim was worthless. The roaming pig became a living symbol of the bigger conflict, of the British company's disregard for the American settlers and their rights. Each time he saw it, his frustration grew, mixing with the underlying fear and resentment that defined life on this disputed island. On this particular morning, seeing the fresh damage, something inside him snapped. His patience had finally been exhausted. All the warnings, all the polite requests had come to nothing. The pig stood there, a four-legged embodiment of the arrogance he felt from his British neighbors. He was a plain-spoken man, a frontiersman who believed in direct action. If his neighbor would not control his animal, then he would have to solve the problem himself. He walked back into his cabin, his mind set. He emerged moments later with his rifle in his hands. The decision was made. The time for talking was over. The pig had rooted in his garden for the last time. Lyman Cutler raised his rifle. He aimed at the pig, busy with its destructive feast. The gunshot shattered the morning quiet. The pig fell silent. He had destroyed the property of the Hudson's Bay Company. Charles Griffin, the pig's owner, heard the news. He marched over to Cutler's property, furious. He found Cutler standing near the animal's body. The confrontation was immediate. The argument escalated. Griffin demanded compensation. He valued the boar at $100. Cutler offered $10. Griffin angrily rejected the offer. Griffin declared he would report Cutler to the British authorities. Cutler retorted that the British had no jurisdiction over him. The personal dispute had now become a matter of national sovereignty. Furious, Charles Griffin sought out the British authorities and reported the incident. The British saw it as a simple case of property destruction that needed to be brought to justice under the Crown. Days later, British officials arrived at Cutler's cabin to arrest him, but Cutler was surrounded by armed American settlers, his neighbors. They formed a protective circle, making it clear they wouldn't allow him to be taken. Outnumbered, the British officials withdrew, warning that the matter was far from over. Feeling vulnerable, the settlers drafted a petition for military protection. They sent it to General Harney, describing the pig incident and their fear of the British, asking for soldiers. The settlers' petition landed on the desk of General William S. Harney, a man known for his fierce patriotism and suspicion of the British. Seeing the dispute as British aggression, Harney didn't hesitate. He took matters into his own hands. On July 27, 1859, the situation escalated. Acting on Harney's orders, the USS Massachusetts steamed into Griffin Bay. Soldiers disembarked with rifles and cannon, setting up camp. The American flag was raised, declaring U.S. sovereignty. A civil dispute had become a military standoff. The spark had caught fire, and the world awaited the British response. The arrival of Captain George Pickett and his company transformed San Juan Island. For American settlers, it was vindication. After feeling overshadowed by the Hudson's Bay Company, they now saw their nation's flag flying proudly. The USS Massachusetts anchored in the bay, a powerful symbol. Pickett established camp overlooking Griffin Bay, declaring the island under U.S. military protection. He asserted American sovereignty over the disputed land. The settlers celebrated, feeling patriotic pride. Pickett's actions were bold, placing the island under martial law. He warned the British that any attempt to arrest an American would be an act of aggression. The conflict escalated between two powerful nations. The situation became infinitely more dangerous. For the British at Bellevue Farm, the sight was unsettling. The arrival of the American Eagle was a direct challenge. News of the American military landing on San Juan Island reached Governor James Douglas in Victoria. Outraged, he viewed it as a hostile invasion and affront to the Queen. Douglas, a firm believer in British strength, ordered the Royal Navy to dispatch warships. The HMS Tribune, a powerful steam frigate, arrived first, soon joined by two more warships. Griffin Bay filled with the imposing silhouettes of the Royal Navy. Anchored close to the American camp, cannons aimed, the message was clear. Pickett's small company faced overwhelming naval firepower. The standoff became incredibly tense, turning San Juan Island into a dangerous place. Settlers were gripped by fear, knowing they were in the line of fire. A single mistake could unleash devastating cannon fire. The peaceful island had become a powder keg. In this escalating crisis, the fate of peace rested on local commanders. On the American side was Captain George Pickett, determined to hold the island. He looked out at the Royal Navy and knew confrontation would be suicidal. On the British side was Captain Geoffrey Hornby, a seasoned officer. Under orders from Governor Douglas to expel Pickett's troops, Hornby was troubled. He recognized that attacking U.S. soldiers would be an act of war. Hornby refused the order, reasoning it wasn't his place to start a war. This act was perhaps the most important moment in the entire standoff. The two commanders, despite pressure from superiors, created a fragile agreement to avoid bloodshed. The standoff on San Juan Island became a silent duel. Americans on the hill, British warships in the bay, each side watching, waiting. Instead of gunfire, there were formal, almost comically polite letters. Each side defending its claim, neither willing to back down. Soldiers dug trenches and built earthworks, always under the threat of the other's cannons, but no one fired a shot. The tension was suffocating, but it bought time. News of the crisis slowly reached Washington and London, alarming leaders who wanted no war over a remote island. The fate of peace now rested not with the men on the island, but with distant politicians forced to finally pay attention. The war of nerves had done its job. It stalled disaster, and forced the world's most powerful empires to the negotiating table. As the standoff dragged on, both sides dug in, literally. Americans built Pickett's Redoubt, a scrappy earthwork fort, while the British landed Marines and constructed English camp on the opposite end. The island was now split by two fortified camps, each a symbol of stubborn resolve. Encounters between patrols were tense but peaceful. The soldiers had little appetite for war. Instead of building understanding, both sides built barriers, forts, not bridges. The standoff became a bizarre, entrenched reality, with each side waiting for orders from faraway capitals. The question was no longer who would fire first, but who would blink first in Washington or London. Despite the looming threat of war, a strange camaraderie grew between the American and British troops. Officers exchanged formal visits, shared drinks, and avoided politics. Enlisted men traded goods and even celebrated holidays together. The so-called Pig War picnics saw joint sporting events and friendly horse races, much to the frustration of hardline commanders. For the men on the ground, it was easier to be neighbors than enemies. This absurdly polite standoff diffused tension and made accidental conflict unlikely. The soldiers' unexpected diplomacy kept the peace while real diplomats scrambled for a solution. The crisis showed that sometimes humanity on the front lines can outshine the bluster of distant leaders. News of the standoff finally reached President Buchanan, who was horrified to learn his general had nearly started a war over a pig. With the nation already on the brink of civil war, Buchanan had no interest in fighting Britain. He quickly opened diplomatic channels, realizing the crisis was fueled by hot-headed commanders, not official policy. Buchanan's first move rein in General Harney and regained control. Both governments agreed, this was a mess created on the frontier, not in their capitals. The president needed a respected figure to calm the situation and negotiate a peaceful solution. The choice would be critical. The right leader could pull two empires back from the brink. President Buchanan sent General Winfield Scott, America's most respected soldier and a skilled diplomat, to the Pacific Northwest. Scott's arrival changed everything. His authority was unquestioned, his reputation immense. He immediately took command, sidelined Harney, and opened direct talks with British Governor Douglas. Scott criticized American aggression, soothing British fears, and signaling a desire for peace. His solution: a joint temporary occupation, equal numbers of American and British troops, no escalation, no loss of face. Douglas agreed, and the massive military buildup melted away. Scott's calm, diplomatic approach diffused the crisis almost overnight. The threat of war vanished, replaced by a sensible, peaceful arrangement. With Scott's agreement in place, the warships sailed away and most troops withdrew, leaving only small, equal detachments on the island. For 12 years, San Juan Island existed in peaceful limbo. 2 camps, 2 flags, no fighting. Soldiers visited each other's camps, shared supplies, and celebrated together. The crisis faded into routine. The joint occupation gave diplomats time to negotiate a permanent solution, far from the threat of violence. The border dispute became a matter for surveyors and lawyers, not soldiers. The pig war ended not with a battle, but with a handshake and a shared commitment to peace. The lesson was clear. Even on the brink of war, creative diplomacy and human decency can prevail. The final resolution to the San Juan Island border dispute came after the American Civil War. Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany arbitrated. In 1872, after reviewing maps and the 1846 treaty, the Kaiser ruled in favor of the American claim, making the San Juan Islands part of the United States. The British peacefully lowered the Union Jack. Today, the legacy is preserved at the San Juan Island National Historical Park. These sites memorialize a war that was wisely avoided, solidifying a new dynamic between the United States and Great Britain, all set in motion by a single hungry pig. The story of the Pig War offers profound lessons about conflict and diplomacy. It reminds us how easily small disputes can escalate into major crises, especially when national pride is at stake. The actions of individuals can have far-reaching consequences. However, it is also a story of de-escalation and restraint. The refusal of British Captain Hornby to obey a rash order to attack prevented bloodshed. The crisis was solved because individuals chose diplomacy over destruction. The fraternization between the American and British soldiers was a crucial safety valve. Ultimately, the Pig War is a story about perspective. The story encourages us to look at our own conflicts and consider how they might appear to future generations. It is a hopeful lesson from a war in which the only casualty was the pig itself.